Great. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Nyasha Chingoren, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to this first webinar in our series of webinars that is looking at utilizing the African human rights systems to advocate for sexual reproductive health and rights and bodily autonomy and integrity. We will be holding a series of 3 webinars that will look at different aspects of the African human rights system, and then look at how we as civil society organizations, particularly organizations working at national level, can actually utilize what comes out of and what is created from these mechanisms in our national advocacy, and to advocate for the rights of people within our country context. So this webinar is, of course, brought by the AIDS and Rights Alliance for Southern Africa. And as you know, the AIDS and Rights Alliance, as some of you know, the AIDS and Rights Alliance for Southern Africa, ARASA, is a regional partnership organization that is working in 18 countries in East and Southern Africa, with a partnership of approximately 100 partners across the region. And that is working to advance bodily autonomy and integrity in the African countries that we work in, with our partners and at the regional level. So just before we get started with the webinar, I just wanted to talk us a little bit through our rules of engagement. So ARASA has a zero tolerance policy regarding bullying, derogatory language, sexism, homophobia, transphobia, etc. People who disrupt the meeting or display any such behavior will be removed from the meeting. So just a heads up on that. This webinar is being recorded and live streamed on Facebook, and the recording will be uploaded on the ARASA YouTube channels afterwards. So this is a notification just in terms of your own engagement. If for any reason you want to preserve your privacy, then you might want to use a different name, that you know that this is going to be a public meeting or a public webinar. Unfortunately, today we will not be providing interpretation, an interpretation function for this webinar, but we do encourage our friends and Lusophone colleagues to engage in us if you need to type something in the chat, or if you're going to be using the raise hand function to speak in the language that you're most comfortable with. Colleagues on the call might not be professional French and Portuguese speakers, but will be able to decipher what you are saying if you're most comfortable speaking in Portuguese and French. In addition, we will give an opportunity in this particular webinar for people to use both the text function, so the Q&A box, to ask questions, engage with one another, share your own experience on working with the African Commission on Human and People's Rights. But we will also have opportunities to use the raise hands function at certain points in the webinar. Should you want to speak, please just pop your raise hand icon there, and the facilitator will bring you into the conversation. We ask that you, unlike what I'm doing now, be very concise in your contributions so that we'll be able to hear as many voices as possible. Next slide, please, Hedgen. So before we actually start, I just wanted to take a very quick poll in terms of our engagement with the African Human Rights Commission. So a poll has just popped up on your screens now. The first question is, have you engaged with the African Commission on Human and People's Rights? And you just need to click yes or no in the chat function. And then the second question, do you think the African Human and People's Rights is a useful platform to advocate for sexual and reproductive health and rights and bodily autonomy? And the final question, do you believe that the African Commission on Human and People's Rights is independent? So we look forward to engaging with you with that poll. There's still about 45 seconds or so on the clock, I think. So please do just type in your responses. It will enable our panelists and the facilitator to engage with you a little bit more on the issues of hand, if we, get a chance to know you a little bit more and know where you're coming from. So I see that the majority of people on the call at the moment have engaged with the African Commission. So the majority, 67% at this point, have answered yes. In terms of usefulness of the platform, so far, yes, the majority are saying it is a useful platform. And we will have a bit of a conversation around, some of these questions as we move to the panelists. And then at the moment, I am also getting quite a split response to the question, do you believe that the African Commission on Human and People's Rights is independent? The minority on this one are actually saying yes. So most people are saying that they do believe that the commission is independent. 55% of the respondents at the moment are saying no, they do not believe that the African Commission on Human and People's Rights is independent. And 27% of you are not sure how to answer that question at this point. And that's okay. This is part of the conversation that we will be trying to unpack as we go into the panelist session later on, and having a conversation about why this question is important, why this whole question around independence of the commission is important. Hejin, I think we've done almost 3 minutes of the poll. I do think we can end it and share the results as I move on. Okay, great. So as we move on, I just wanted to welcome our main facilitator for the 3 sessions that we're going to be having, and also to just highlight our wonderful 2 panelists that we're going to be speaking to a little bit later on in the session. Really amazing activists and advocates for sexual and reproductive health and rights. So in terms of our main facilitator, I am introducing, it's my pleasure, honor, to introduce Muluka Mti-Drummond. Muluka is a senior human rights consultant who has over 15 years of experience working on human rights in a number of international and regional human rights organizations. Muluka's specialization is in human rights in Africa and UN advocacy. She has extensive experience in conducting expert human rights research, including field research, producing reports and submissions to human rights bodies and other advocacy and campaigning material. I've known Muluka, I think, for about 8 years now, worked with her at the Southern African Litigation Center some time back. So I'm really happy to be introducing Muluka, and I'm very confident of Muluka's expertise in this area. Later on in the, and we're going to start off with a presentation by Muluka, and Muluka is really just going to give us a general overview of the African Commission, what it is, why it exists, and kind of, you know, what we as civil society need to know about the African Commission on Human and People's Rights. From there, we're going to have 2 fantastic panelists who Muluka will introduce in more detail when we get to that section of the session. But I did, for now, want to just mention that we have Fadzai Mparutsa from the Coalition of African Lesbians, and we have Suzanne from Ipas Africa Alliance, both wonderful activists working on bodily autonomy and integrity issues that will be engaging with us and speaking from their own experience and the experience of their organizations later on in the afternoon. So without further ado, just one more thing that I wanted to say. Please do identify yourself in the, when you name yourself in the chat. We would really appreciate it if you would just put your pronoun next to your name, so that when we have a conversation later on where we allow you to raise your hand, we refer to you correctly. So with that and without further ado, I will hand over to Muluka Mti-Drummond. Muluka, over to you.
Thank you, Nyasha. And thank you everyone for attending this session. It's my pleasure to be able to present this session to you today. I am aware, looking at the poll results, that many of you have already engaged with the African Commission. So some of what I say may not be new to you. Some of it may be new. Some of it just gives us an opportunity to discuss and think about things further. And I think to start off with, I'm not sure if we can use the raise hand functions, but if we can, I'll try that now. Those who have engaged with the African Commission, would you be able to please raise your hands? Unfortunately, I can only see the panelists. Oh no, here we are, we've got participants. Okay, I can see. So we have 2 participants in the attendee, 2 participants who have engaged at the moment. That's all I see. Great. So we have 2 people who have, or 1 person now who's happy enough to raise their hands to say that they have engaged with the African Commission. I am not sure. Oh, apologies. I'm not sure how my video went off. I'm not sure if I will be able to have the response of those who have raised their hands. Will we be allowed to talk? I cannot identify. Oh, there we are. Linda has raised her hand. Linda, I have now got you on the screen. Would you be able to just tell us a little bit about how you have engaged with the African Commission? And would you mind turning on your camera so that we can see who we're engaging with at the moment?
I don't, we're trying to figure out how to switch on my camera because I'm using my phone.
Okay, that's fine. Don't worry. Maybe just to answer briefly the question of how you've engaged, what have you done at the African Commission level?
I was part of the Namibian team that developed the report on SOG-esque and key populations in the last review 4 years ago, and of which we as Namibians had a coalition in drafting this report, of which I, as a team also, we had the opportunity to attend. So what is interesting about the African Commission versus the Human Rights Council, there's a great difference in the experiences, because the African Commission, in our experience with the African Commission, besides working with our ministry locally, what we had to do is submit our report locally here and also at the regional level, of which we also took a responsibility to prepare questions for all commissioners, because the commissioners themselves don't have time once they've reviewed your report to really develop questions. So what we did is a whole package of what the report is and what the different commissioners could ask questions on. And then we also engage directly the commissioners to affirm whether they've received our communications, of which, yeah.
Thank you. That's so you've engaged a lot with basically the state reporting processes and shadow reports. So that it's good to know that there are people who have done this work in this regard. So now I'm just going to go on talking briefly about the African Commission itself. What is the mandate of the African Commission? The African Commission on Human and People's Rights is the body that's set up to promote and protect human and people's rights, and also to interpret the Charter. Interesting thing is the use of the word peoples as plural, not people apostrophe S. So this peoples talks about groups of people and not human, because it sounds a bit redundant, but we're talking about human as individuals, but all of us as individuals, and peoples as groups of people. So the African Commission is set up to protect and promote the rights of people in Africa, and to also interpret the Charter. When it comes to working with the African Commission, there are a number of things that civil societies can use in working. So it's the treaties. Civil society may work with the special mechanisms, attend the African Commission sessions themselves, work through presenting parallel or shadow reports, alternative reports, whatever you want to call them, as Linda has referred to here, and also maybe contributing to the state reports. And then there's also communications. So these are the different sections that I want to look at. So I have a question here for participants. What would you say are the most relevant treaties at African Commission level in relation to sexual and reproductive health rights, as well as bodily autonomy and integrity? If you could raise your hands, I will be able to see who has an answer. So again, what do you think are the most relevant treaties at the African level and to work? Yes, we've got somebody here. Omar, I have allowed you to talk. Omar, if you may respond to the question, please.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
So I would say the relevant treaties would be, of course, the African Charter on Human and People's Rights, the Protocol on the Rights of Women, the African Charter on the Rights and Welfare of the Child. To me, those are pretty relevant.
Thank you very much. And Omar, are there any specific sections, provisions of these charters that you don't have to tell me the number because I'd be surprised if you remember in the exact article, but any specific rights contained in these charters that you think are relevant for sexual and reproductive health rights?
Yes, of course, and thank you for the opportunity. In the African Charter on Human and People's Rights, the Charter mandates respect for human dignity. Article 2 guarantees the rights to every individual without any distinction of any kind, such as sex and social status. And then Article 2 also ensures equality of treatment of individuals irrespective of their sexual orientation as well, and that was also relayed in the court case in 2006. And then the Protocol on the Rights of Women, it's really a regional African treaty that seeks to promote principles of equality, and it's kind of a mechanism by which legislations amongst other member states can be adopted in order to reduce discrimination and infringements on human rights. And then lastly, I'd say the African Charter on the Rights and Welfare of the Child. It contains like a general prohibition on discrimination, which covers the sex or other status of the child and or of the child's parents. So it really prohibits discrimination on your social status, that being sexual orientation, or on your sex, so your gender identity as well. I hope I covered that.
Thank you, Omar. Yes, you've covered most of the, if not all the articles that I would have said yes. So definitely the African Charter on Human and People's Rights, looking at provisions that deal with equality and non-discrimination. When we talk about issues of bodily autonomy and integrity, bodily integrity, provisions dealing with bodily integrity in all the charters will cover that. Issues of cruel, inhuman, degrading treatment, when it comes to issues of key populations, LGBTIQ+, freedom of expression, association, especially if it's an issue related to the setting up of associations for key populations, the right to health, and harmful practices in the Maputo Protocol. The Maputo Protocol talks specifically about sexual health and reproductive rights. The Charter on the Rights of the Child, again, also talks about right to health, harmful practices, sexual exploitation, of course, equality and non-discrimination. So as Omar has said, yes, the charters that are relevant, though here we have the 8 core charters, there will be more. This morning, right now, today, actually, as we speak, I know there's a discussion on the adoption of the Charter on the Rights of Older Persons in Africa and the Charter on the Rights of persons with disabilities in Africa. And all of them will contain some provisions relevant to sexual and reproductive health rights of older persons and sexual and reproductive health rights of persons with disabilities. So provisions which will be relevant in those regards. But as Omar has stated, yes, definitely the African Charter on Human and People's Rights, the Charter on the Rights and Welfare of the Child, and the Protocol on the Rights of Women in Africa. The other acts are there, treaties are there, which may not be as relevant, but I just wanted to include them there. So with the African Commission, they produce the treaties, which we've just referred to, as well as what we call soft laws. And these soft laws are documents that explain or give more detail to the provisions in the treaty. And these include general comments, guidelines, principles and declarations, and resolutions, which can be thematic or specific to a country. There's also, as far as I know, only one model law, which gives an example, which in this case deals specifically with the right of access to information. And it's an example for states to show how they can promote, protect, and develop the right of access to information in their countries through laws. So when it comes to the general comments provide information, further information on the rights contained in the charters and the protocol, explaining what exactly the duties of the states are and the rights of individuals are. As you know, in many occasions, the protocols will only have one line or a short paragraph saying everybody has the right to health. But then these general comments give further provisions and information on exactly what that is. There have been about 6 general comments developed by the African Commission. I have not included the joint general commission between the African Commission and the African Committee here on the rights and welfare of the child. We will discuss that in the next session next week. The most relevant comments for the purposes of sexual and reproductive health rights is general comment number 1, which looks at the rights of women and HIV. General comment number 4 as well, which looks at the right to redress for victims of torture and other cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment. In this general comment number 4, the African Commission recognized that acts of violence against men, boys, persons with psychosocial disabilities, and LGBTI populations are of equal concern and must also be adequately and effectively addressed by state parties. So it was recognizing that this is does not just apply to women, that when we talk about sexual violence against women, this is a violation of rights to bodily autonomy and integrity, but it does not only apply to women, it applies also to men and boys and LGBTQI plus populations. Also, general comment number 2 is actually the most important because it deals specifically with women's right to health, including sexual and reproductive health in Africa. So these are the general comments that provide further details on these. When we talk about the guidelines, principles, and declarations, there are a number that have been developed. The most relevant to our topic in this case would be those on combating sexual violence and its consequences in Africa, bearing in mind that sexual violence impacts on bodily autonomy and integrity. I see I have a hand up. I will allow the question. Gumi, is it Gumisai? Sorry if I pronounced your name
now
wrongly.
connected to laptop 5E6.
Excuse me, is that Gumisai?
No, sorry, I raised my hand by mistake. I was trying to lower my hand anyway.
Okay, that's all right. So I'll continue. So saying that the guidelines, principles, and declarations, there are a number. The most relevant are the ones on combating sexual violence and its consequences in Africa, which was adopted in 2017. And to some regard, the ones on economics, so the guidelines on economic, social, and cultural rights, because the right to health is an economic, social, and cultural right. So when we talk about the right to health, sexual and reproductive health rights, the guidelines and principles on this would be relevant, as well as those on reporting guidelines for the states. So the reporting guidelines for the states are important for civil society to ensure that the state are actually reporting on relevant issues. And so the reporting guidelines would help in ensuring that the states are reporting sexual and reproductive health rights as well. So it's useful, even if it's specifically for the states, it is useful for civil society to also look at these reporting guidelines. I see also that the chat function is going crazy. I'll take a second to pause and see. Okay, that is not for me to deal with, it's all right. There are several hundreds actually, of resolutions that the African Commission has adopted. I have included here the relevant ones in relation to sexual and reproductive health rights. These are the relevant thematic ones. There have been some specific country ones as well, but I'm referred only to the ones thematic wise. So resolution 53 on HIV/AIDS pandemic, and the other resolutions here, I've highlighted resolution 275 on protection against violence and other human rights violations against persons on the basis of their role or imputed on the basis of their real or imputed sexual orientation or gender identity. That one is one that is specific to key populations and also basically to LGBTIQ plus community. The others that are here are more specific to sexual reproductive health rights, as well as bodily autonomy and integrity. The model law I have already referred to. So these are just examples of some of the resolutions, and it's useful to look at them to see what has been said. So how do you work with the commissioners, and who are the commissioners? That is a picture of Honorable Solomon Derso, who is currently the chairperson of the African Commission. The commission should have 11 members, but I believe currently, I might be wrong, but currently there are 9, I believe. And the commissioners are experts who are nominated by their state parties, and then they're nominated by countries, the states, and then they are elected by the AU Assembly. So there's a bit of political, politics around the nomination of them. They have mandates of 6 years, and these are renewable. So you have commissioners who have been around for 12 years, and some longer, because I do not think there's actually a time frame. I mean, it's renewable. It doesn't say how long, but some have been there for less of a time. Not many have been there for much longer. The commissioners, they are what we call special rapporteurs or special mechanisms. So special mechanisms of the African Commission. And there are a number of special rapporteurs, 5 special rapporteurs, and these work on the specific thematic areas. Specifically in relation to the work that we're talking about here, sexual reproductive health rights, is the Special Rapporteur on the Rights of Women, Honorable Kaitesi, who's now currently the Special Rapporteur on the Rights of Women. When it comes to issues of civil society organizations, especially if there are attacks against human rights defenders working on sexual reproductive health rights, LGBTIQ plus rights, then the Special Rapporteur on Human Rights Defenders, Honorable Lumbu, as well, is relevant. I've just included all the other Special Rapporteurs there in their pictures. In addition to Special Rapporteurs, there are other special mechanisms. So there's the Special Rapporteurs who are individuals, but there are also groups who work on specific issues. So we have the working group, and Economic, Social and Cultural Rights is a working group that was relevant in this case. Rights of older persons and people with disabilities. And then specifically, I think the Committee on the Protection of the Rights of People Living with HIV. Nyasha is a member of the committee, this Committee on the Protection of the Rights of People Living with HIV. So if we have any further questions on that towards the end, we can ask her more on that. So these are the working groups and the committees as well of the African Commission. What are the mandates? So these special mechanisms have to analyze national legislation and policies of states to see that they are complying with their human rights obligations. They undertake investigations to countries, especially where there are concerns of massive violations of human rights. They also undertake promotional activities where it is felt that there's a need for more promotion or strengthening of the rights, of certain rights. They make public interventions, so they can do statements, press releases. They also respond to concerns in countries by writing to the relevant authorities if there's a specific concern. And then they submit reports to the ordinary session of the African Commission. So whenever there's a session of the African Commission, then they will produce their reports stating what they have done, what actions they have taken to promote or protect rights in the region. The other mandates that they can organize seminars they can disseminate relevant human rights standards. And they often organize these seminars or conferences partnering with other organizations, because they're special mechanisms, so they'll partner with civil society organizations. They also develop and propose strategies to the African Commission on how to implement human rights. And they also promote the facilitation of these such standards. Sometimes they do the promotion through the commissioning of studies, and through certain campaigns as well. They may do this work through certain campaigns. And I've got 2 examples here. So this is a study on HIV, the law and human rights in Africa. And also the example of the campaign to decriminalize abortion, which was started by the Special Rapporteur on the Rights of Women. So these are examples of activities outside of the country visits and and outside of the standards that may be developed. We're talking about reports and campaigns as examples. So I will actually pass this question for now. I want to go on to the African Commission session. There are usually 2 sessions a year, 2 ordinary sessions. There may also be extraordinary sessions. The ordinary sessions are the ones that are generally open, or have sessions, that are open to the public. And they occur in April or May, sometime around there, as well as October or November. So it may be towards the end of October, early November, when these ordinary sessions start. And prior to this, there's the NGO forum, which tends to last about 3 days. Of course, situations may be slightly different, and some of our panelists will talk about how the situation has changed a bit given the pandemic and things being online. They can give us a bit of information on that. So the NGO forum is an opportunity for civil society organizations to meet, to discuss issues relevant to their line of work and their concern. I will not go very much into the NGO forum right now because I'm aware of time, and I want to make sure that we have opportunity for our panelists to speak as well as to present. The African Commission session, and this is the African Commission session, like I say, there's an opportunity for civil society organizations to present oral statements during the African Commission session, during the public sessions of the African Commission. And the oral statements can either be presented under the agenda item on state of human rights in Africa, or these oral statements can be presented during the reports of the special mechanisms. So with regards to the issues of sexual and reproductive health rights, the Special Rapporteur on the Rights of Women will present her report, and there's an opportunity for civil society organizations to raise issues specifically on sexual and reproductive health rights of women after the presentation of this report. Alternatively, oral statements can be presented under the broad State of Human Rights in Africa. The thing with the State of Human Rights in Africa session is that it's very broad. It touches on everything and anything, it's a mix of things, whereas when you do it specifically under the special mechanisms, it is an opportunity to raise directly with the special mechanism concerns. And as we have seen in the past, sometimes the special mechanism will then reply and say, we will bring this up with the relevant states. So the African Commission as well is not just about oral statements, it also provides an opportunity for informal meetings with the commissioners. And there's an opportunity to have side events, which will include state parties and commissioners on the panel. And these side events can raise concerns, highlight campaigns, kind of advocate for certain positions. There's also an opportunity at times for CSOs to have a panel during the actual session of the African Commission, so not on the side event, but actually during the African Commission itself. Now, I've talked about sessions of the African Commission. Those of you who have been to African Commission will know, what is an important prerequisite for the optimum engagement at the public session. So how can you best, if you want to make sure you use the full possibility of the public sessions and advocacy at the public session, what is an important prerequisite? So maybe if anyone knows, could you please raise your hand? And alternatively, I do like to pick on people. So if we do not have an individual volunteering.
Hi, I'm sorry, I can't raise my hand because I'm the host of the meeting, but I just wanted to, if I can contribute, just to say that I think there are two ways of contributing. One is if you have observer status, it obviously allows you to engage with some of these mechanisms more effectively. For example, only civil society organizations that have formal observer status, and obviously Cal, Fadzai from Cal will touch upon this observer status issue. Having observer status allows you to formally engage during sessions. So if at any point you feel like you need to formally engage with the African Commission during their sessions, you will need to either have observer status or cooperate with organizations that have observer status. As a RASA, for example, we often allow other organizations to quote unquote utilize our observer status in order to raise specific issues. However, I think if you don't have observer status, there are still a lot of the informal spaces and ways of engaging. But I think in reflection, one of the most important prerequisites to in effectively engaging is often the first thing commissioners will tell you or ask you or state parties will interfere with is, where's your evidence? And I think at any point in engagement, one of the biggest prerequisites that you need is that you have to have proper documentation of the issues that you're raising or any human rights violations that you're raising when you're actually engaging with the committee. So I just, that will be from my side.
Great, thank you. And I think you have basically effectively presented my next slide. Observer status. So you don't need to have it, but it does help in making statements and oral statements either during the agenda on state of human rights in Africa or the special the reports of the special mechanism. So observer status basically allows individuals and CSOs to actively participate in the sessions. In order to be accorded observer status, individuals will have to first meet the criteria, and that's, first of all, the objectives must be in line with the fundamental principles and objectives of the African Charter and the Maputo Protocol. They must be an NGO working in the field of human rights in Africa. So they don't necessarily have to be in Africa, but they have to be working on Africa. And in the past, we've had organizations based in the UK, in the US, other places who have been granted observer status and even now still have observer status because they are working on human rights in Africa. Then the application is made through a written process to the Secretariat and a set of documents have to be sent. We won't go into that, but there is a resolution on the criteria for granting and enjoying observer status, and that provides all the full details if anyone is interested in going on, in finding out more. I have the slide now, 55, Kenya. This looks a bit out of place, but 55, Kenya should, point number 2, enact a comprehensive equality and non-discrimination law. Roman numeral 3, point number 3, end traditional practices such as FGM. What is this? Has anyone ever seen this before? Who has ever seen something like this before and can identify what it is? Or take a guess? Ooh, I see somebody in the chat. Somebody's put female genital mutilation. The concluding observations. Thank you. Yes, that's the answer. These are concluding observations from the African Commission, and this would have been the concluding observations to the report of Kenya. What in the world are the concluding observations? So part of the work of the African Commission is to review the compliance of the states with the human rights treaties. And in order to do this, countries have to submit their human rights reports to the African Commission. So they'll submit their report on how they have complied with the provisions of the African Charter on Human and People's Rights, how they have complied with the provisions of the Maputo Protocol. The one on the on the rights of the child is not submitted to the African Commission, it's submitted to the African Committee of Experts on the Rights and Welfare of the Child. We'll talk about that next week. So these reports are submitted by countries to the African Commission prior to the session. and they are posted on the African Commission website. Civil society organizations have an opportunity to either work with the state in producing these country reports where they specify everything that the state has done, or providing an alternative shadow, parallel report to the state. So some civil societies do both. So what happens is that the report is posted on the African Commission website. Civil society can look at the report, and if you see that issues of sexual and reproductive health rights are not included, issues related to bodily autonomy or integrity are not included, or that the information that's included you want to challenge, then you can include, provide this information in your own alternative report. It does not, the alternative report does not, or parallel report does not have to cover every single issue in the African Charter. It can just be on sexual and reproductive health rights. So, you do not have to feel intimidated thinking, I do not have any information on freedom of expression or, fair trial rights. You can provide an alternative, a parallel report that only talks about sexual reproductive health rights. Civil society organizations also have the opportunity of attending the sessions, because there's a session where the African Commission is asking states questions, but NGOs cannot participate. After this, then the slide I showed you before, the concluding observation is developed by African Commission. And in the concluding recommendations, the African Commission will raise concerns about certain activities, may raise concerns about things that have not been done in the state, human rights violations or failure to implement rights, and will make recommendations on how the state can improve it. So it's quite important to engage in this either through the alternative reports, also through going to the African Commission and speaking to the commissioners, and kind of like, trying to advocate for certain questions to be asked by the state. To be asked by the commissioners. If you've been trying to get an answer to certain questions on the ground and you're not getting it, this is a place to go and try and see if you can get commissioners to ask that question. So communications, I'm going to go through this quite quickly as well. Communications are kind of like court cases. We call them quasi-judicial. So they're kind of complaints that are brought to the African Commission on violations of rights. There are two types of complaints. There are those that are brought by states against states. And up until 2004, there was only one case of a state versus a state. And we've since then we've had two others, but in the history of the African Commission, there have, only been 3 cases of state versus states. The other complaints are from individuals and NGOs against a state. So these are situations where concerns are raised regarding the violation of human rights by states. A communication can only be brought against a state that has ratified the African Charter. So in the case of Morocco, you cannot bring a communication against or a complaint against Morocco at the African Commission because it withdrew from the OAU in 1984. There have been a number of cases, complaints, communications brought in relation to the issues that we have raised here. The first was in 94, William A. Coulson versus Zimbabwe. And in this case, the complainant alleged that his right to equality was being violated, and he was being discriminated against on the basis of his sexual orientation, because there were laws prohibiting consensual same-sex acts between consenting male adults in Zimbabwe. This case was not decided by the African Commission because in the end, the complainant withdrew the case. So we do not have any decision about whether Zimbabwe had violated these rights, although we know they had. The other case that's quite of importance is the Zimbabwe Human Rights NGO Forum versus Zimbabwe. And in this case, the African court said that Article 2 of the African Charter, which talks about the right to equality and non-discrimination, even though it does not specifically mention sexual orientation is a ground on which you cannot discriminate. So the African Charter basically said there is a right of equal treatment for all individuals, irrespective of their sexual orientation. Most recently in 2014, there was a case brought by a number of organizations, including the Center for Reproductive Rights against Nigeria. And this case related to the high maternal mortality rates in the country, so issues of sexual, reproductive, and health rights. There is no conclusion yet to the, as far as I know. It's not publicly available to this case, but it is a case to watch, and we'll be waiting to hear what the African Commission says in regards to sexual and reproductive health rights and maternal mortality. There's a lot of different stages of a communication, and I will not go into those in detail, but it will be, you know, if you're interested, this is something that we can pick up another time. This is basically the admissibility criteria, just talks about what needs to be in a complaint and how, and things like the complaint cannot include insulting language. Sometimes, you know, as civil society organizations, we get so angry about violations and we want to write out a complaint. We just have to be careful not to put insulting languages in that complaint. And there's also the requirement to exhaust domestic remedies, but I won't go into that. These slides will be shared with you and you'll have this, and you can always speak to Nyasha and others, colleagues of ARASA, if you want to hear more about that. So in a nutshell, what are the advocacy opportunities around the African Commission? First of all, submitting parallel reports, as I've mentioned. Secondly, carrying out advocacy activities during the public session and on the margins of the public session. So oral statements, panel events, side events, meetings with NGO and state officials, and suggesting items for the agenda. Advocating for the adoption of soft law, and this can also be done, you know, during the African Commission, building the relationships with the commissioners, raising issues of, you know, soft law that you think will need to be, you know, general comments or guidelines that will need to be developed. And attending the sessions is a good opportunity to kind of develop the relationships to then possibly advocate for the adoption of such laws. Bringing communications before the African Commission against the state for violation of rights, so that the African Commission can then very clearly set out what the rights are and the obligations. And then also submitting information to commissioners for follow-up. So if there are any concerns about human rights violations in your specific countries, you can send letters of concern to the commissioners, who can then follow up, or invite advocate for the commissioners to be able to undertake investigative missions, and they can hopefully be allowed by the authorities to do that. I have spoken a lot. I will end it there. Before we move on to our panel, I want to hand over. I'm going to actually stop sharing. So before we hand over to the panel, and I have a discussion with the panel where we'll flesh out this more a bit, I'd like us to listen to a video, and this is a video. I don't know if Hejin, you want to introduce the video?
So this video is a small snippet from an interview with about the African Commission, and this is with Honorable Derso, who is the current chair, just briefly highlighting the independence of the Commission, sort of to introduce the panel discussion or part of it.
When we say the African Commission is independence, what we are saying is basically, as far as the execution and implementation of its mandate, the Commission should be free from interference and influence from any party. The independence of the Commission, therefore, functions within this ecosystem of relationships
between the Commission on the one hand and states parties on the other hand. Therefore, allows the Commission to authoritatively, freely and independently speaks to the issue of human rights facing the African continent. Those are the kinds of things that are very important in order to enhance the consciousness and awareness of the wider African public about the rights and freedoms enshrined in the African Charter. Thereby, they are able to own these rights and freedoms, the creation of institutional, policy, and resources necessary for the implementation of these rights and freedoms at the national and the local levels. When we say...
Great, thank you. There we are. Thank you very much. And after this, from here, I would like to then move on to the session where we speak to our panelists. We have our two panelists, Fadzai. And Fadzai, apologies if I do not pronounce your surname properly. I will try to now. Fadzai Muparutsa, who is the advocacy manager at the Coalition of African Lesbians, as well as Suzanne Majani, who's the regional and policy advisor at Ipas. Hijin, if you would please stop sharing your, thank you, and then I am going to Suzanne, and would you please turn on your camera so we can spotlight you. Suzanne. There we are, thank you. So these are our two esteemed panelists, and Fadzai, let me start with you. Would you introduce yourself and tell us a bit more about your organization, just to make sure that we all know a bit about your organization here.
Sure. My name is Fadzai Muparutsa. I'm the advocacy manager at the Coalition of African Lesbians. I'm not going to say much about myself. I'm an activist. I am a feminist. I am an anarchist and believe in queer politics. The Coalition of African Lesbians is a queer feminist Pan-African network of 14 organizations in 10 countries in Africa. And we're committed to advancing freedom, justice, and bodily autonomy for all women and people on the African continent and beyond.
Thank you, Fadzai. Suzanne, for those who may have never heard about Ipas and those who do not know you, could you please start by introducing yourself and telling us about a bit about Ipas?
Thanks, Muluka, and hello, everyone. Greetings from Nairobi. My name is Suzanne Majani. I'm a policy advisor with Ipas Africa Alliance. About myself, I'm a lawyer by profession, an ardent reader, and a noisemaker in the Africa spaces in terms of particularly agitating for reproductive rights has been something that I've been doing for the past decade. And about Ipas, Ipas is a global nonprofit organization that works towards increasing women's ability to exercise their sexual and reproductive rights. As Ipas, we believe that every woman has a basic human right to make safe reproductive choices. So we work on the very unpopular topic of access to safe abortion, as well as contraceptives and information and services in that area. So we particularly have 7 country offices across Africa. So we have a country office in DRC, Ethiopia, Malawi, Mozambique, Nigeria, South Africa, and Zambia. And we have 2 regional offices, one in East Africa, where I'm based, and one in Francophone Africa.
Great, thank you. So both of you are working for organizations that are regional organizations, not just based in one country, but working in different countries. And you both refer to yourselves as noisemakers and anarchists. So it's quite interesting to hear that. Fadzai, I want to address my first question to you, because we've just listened to the presentation there, the video clip from Honorable Derso, and he's talking about the independence of the African Commission and the relationship of the African Commission to the AU. At the same time, we had a poll at the beginning, and I think it was only 17% of people who believe that the African Commission is actually independent. And I suppose when we talk about independence of the African Commission, if we can address the elephant in the room here, everyone thinks about the situation of cows and, cows' attempt to get observer status and how it was eventually granted in 2015. But then there was this push by the African Union to have cows' observer status removed. So maybe can you tell us, what's the situation right now? Does cows still have an observer status? What's your opinion about independence in this regard? And yeah, just to maybe update us on the current situation of cows.
So CAL doesn't have observer status. It was withdrawn on the 8th of August in 2018. Am I correct? 2018, yes. So we don't have observer status. And like, I guess the simplest thing to say in regards to the independence of the commission is to say that it's not independent. And I'll base it on a couple of things. So firstly, if we think about the ways in which commissioners are nominated, would be the first point, right? They're nominated by states, which means to some extent, in as much as we say that or assume that they're independent of the states, they are nominated by the state. Beyond being nominated by the state, they're then elected by the AU, which means they do have obligations that they have, firstly to their state who has nominated them, secondly to the AU. And thirdly, which we don't necessarily talk about, is their professional trajectory and how they maneuver and work within the African Commission space. If we think about it in terms of how CAL's observer status played out from, and I won't even start with the 2018 observer status application, right? I'll start with the 2008 process, where we applied for observer status in 2008. And the commission did not give observer status to CAL. Instead, their decision was deferred for 2 years, only until 2010 when we got a formal communication to say that CAL was not going to get observer status because the work of CAL did not fall under the purview of human rights on the continent. In regards to the 2018 observer status, 2018 withdrawal, and the application that happened, and we succeeded in getting our observer status in 2016. I guess there are a couple of things that we can talk about, right? That actually showed the ways in which the commission is not independent. For starters, the ways in which observer status is granted to any organization is that commissioners have a conversation behind closed doors. They decide on granting observer status. During the session, they come out, they explain, they read out, each commissioner has a folder for whichever organization that they're responsible for. They read out the names of the organization, whether they've got an observer status or not. In the case of CAL, when our observer status came up, instead of ending at CAL has received observer status, there was a debate that then happened within the plenary, where the chair at that session then asked commissioners if they agreed with CAL getting observer status. And so the shift from what was the normal protocol, which was to just say you've been granted your observer status, therefore, shifted. And so putting commissioners on the spot to then speak to the granting or them accepting CAL's application and agreeing on whether CAL would get observer status or not within plenary itself was like completely dodgy. But what played out during that plenary session also showed the ways in which commissioners react and respond to not only CAL, but issues around sex and sexuality and gender, right? Like, for instance, if we were to speak to how Omar Bashir, I forget, and I hope I'm actually saying the right, responded to CAL's observer status and calling LGBTI people cockroaches who are invading the continent, right? And the applause that came from people who were in plenary for a commissioner who is mandated to actually be promoting and protecting human rights. And for that to be the attitude that came out is worrisome. But beyond that, if we were to also just think about the ways in which the withdrawal of CAL's observer status came about, it was a directive that came from the Executive Council of the African Union, where the Executive Council requested that CAL's observer status be withdrawn on the grounds that CAL's work in women's rights and sexual rights was contrary to African values, is troubling, right? Because already we're bringing in an issue around tradition and culture and assuming that it's homogenous when it's not, number one. But secondly, when then the commission itself withdrew the observer status, proved that if there's enough pressure put on the commission, they will backtrack on a decision that they've made, right? And made based on human rights, principles and values. And so, no, I don't think they're independent, not then and not now.
So obviously we've raised some of the challenges of working with the commission. We've raised questions about the independence of the commission, and it's important to work in reality, knowing what we're dealing with. But nevertheless, at the same time, CALS does continue to engage with the commission. Is that right? My understanding is that CALS does continue to engage or to work around the African Commission space.
In a very limited capacity, because part of the request from the Executive Council is also about restricting the ways in which CAL can work and function within the African Commission itself. And so there's scrutiny in the ways in which we engage, right? Like, it's almost as though we are being surveilled in the ways that we interact with the commission. And so that limits the ways in which we work. But yes, we do work at the commission in the sense that we can partner and have partnered with organizations that have observer status and have been able to submit joint statements. Beyond that, we've also done some work where we've contributed to general comments, the general comment on torture, where our focus was on cruel and inhuman treatment in regards to abortion. So there is work that happens, but there are limits to the ways in which we could be doing the work that we want to do.
Okay, and maybe just before I go to Suzanne, could you give us kind of a flavor of the kind of work that you've done, or maybe what is the most significant work that you have done as an organization at the African Commission, either before, during, or after your observer status?
Sure. So there's quite a list. So we have contributed to and supported the writing of a publication, a study on the situation of women human rights defenders during Rengansu's time. We've participated on panels, side events, and the one side event I think that's worthy of speaking about, although there have been many, was actually in regards to the independence of the African Commission. And as I was saying, we've contributed to the general comment number 4, the redress on victims of torture, where our analysis was thinking about abortion as torture, or denial of abortion as torture. We've conducted research with Isla Amsha and Heartland Alliance, and the publication that came out of that research on violence based on real and perceived sexual orientation and gender identity was launched at the African Commission, which then led to Resolution 275 on the protection of violence and other human rights violations against persons based on their real or perceived sexual orientation and gender identity. But we've also supported our members to submit shadow reports at the Commission.
So despite the restrictions and the constraints and the surveillance on you, you have obviously managed to contribute to very important work like the Resolution 275 that you referred to, and just the acknowledgement of abortion, the denial of abortion being considered torture. And so I guess there's some way that you are still able to maneuver, and it's not all negative. But obviously under constraints that we need to acknowledge that there have been constraints there.
It's not doom and gloom. And the only way that it's been able to happen is because there are networks and movements that are aligned to our work that we're able to work with.
Yeah, and I think that's very encouraging for many people who may think, well, what's the point of us working on this? I'd also like to take some time to speak to Susan. We're not just keeping you there just to listen to us discuss it, but it's also good to hear from you. Ipas has also worked with the African Commission. Can you give us a bit more detail on like the ways that you have worked, that Ipas has worked with the African Commission? Yeah.
Not to worry, Muluka. I was really enjoying the discussion by Fadzai and us like going through memory lane, because I do remember distinctly the session that we're speaking about in terms of the commission granting CAL observer status. And I remember we were also excited in the room because during that period, the session was in the Gambia. So we were also excited, and then we hear the pushback after the Africa Union session, and we were also disappointed. But coming to how Ipas has worked with the commission, is that we have engaged with them for around 10 years now. And similar to the experience that Fadzai has had, we initiated discussions with the African Commission through seeking observer status. And when we did that, it took a bit of time because we started looking for observer status from around 2012, and we were granted observer status in 2014. So after that, we were able to map and see the training or capacity needs that the commissioners have, to be able to really just work with them and see how can we be able to get some good statements and some positive results on the area of sexual reproductive health rights, particularly with a focus on access to abortion services and contraceptives as per Article 14.2c. So I really also appreciated your presentation, Muluka, because it really brought out some of the things that we have done as Ipas, such as looking for the observer status. And then now as an organization that we have observer status, we do reports to the commission every 2 years. We do activity reports to the commission. However, we also have the privilege, and I say privilege because one thing that I noticed when I started working in this space, it's sort of like a club. You literally need to know how you're engaging, who you engage with. So it's so amazing to have persons like Fadzai and everybody else who I used to connect with on the floor in the commission, because you really need someone to guide you through this is the process that happens. So when you're making statements to the commission, it's sort of like a free for all, because you're only given 2 minutes to make a statement as an NGO, whereby the states can speak very endlessly. And so there's a bit of an imbalance. And this also speaks to the independence or lack of independence of the commission, because there needs to be that we are here to promote the rights of all. So giving the CSOs such a short time versus how long you give the states is already an indicator. But then as an organization, we have the privilege to make statements in the opening sessions of the ordinary session. We also have an opportunity to engage directly with the commission. And whilst everybody is encouraged to do this, as we have been saying all along, it's sort of like a club. So who do you know? How do you engage? How do you access them? So we've been able to do a couple of trainings or colloquia, because you can't train commissioners because of their status. So we've had a couple of colloquia with the commissioners, and this resulted in us being able to develop and work with the commission to develop what you presented, Muluka, as general comment number 2 on access to reproductive health, particularly under Article 14.2c of the Maputo Protocol, which focuses on access to safe abortion as well as contraceptives for all people. And then we also looked at launching the general comment, disseminating it with the commissioners. So just to remind the members that maybe missed out what Muluka said or need a refresher, a general comment is an interpretative guidance for states on how they can be able to protect, promote, or fulfill the rights that are in the Africa Charter or the Maputo Protocol.
Right.
So once we had the general comment launched, we then worked with the Special Rapporteur on the Rights of Women, who currently is, as Muluka mentioned in her presentation, she is Commissioner Kaitesi from Rwanda. This is a safe space, so I can be able to tell people that it has been a bit of a challenge engaging with some of these commissioners because of their backgrounds, the value systems that they have. But then we've been able to have a way forward with the commissioners in launching a campaign for the decriminalization of abortion in Africa. So this campaign was launched by the previous Special Rapporteur on the Rights of Women in January of 2016. So we as Ipas and the partners that we work with have been working with the commissioners on this campaign, which spearheads or just really looks at us decriminalizing abortion in our different contexts, and either having persons being allowed to access abortion services in the context that they have, using the law that we have, because there's no state that absolutely decries abortion compared to some countries in Latin America and Europe. So the campaign has been going on from 2016, and we are looking at how can we be able to enhance it or continue with the work that it's doing, particularly when we're looking at countries ratifying and implementing the protocol. So I think I'll pause there and maybe take some feedback.
So I think, you both have mentioned some amazing pieces of work here that are quite important in developing, promoting, protecting human rights, especially sexual reproductive health rights, bodily autonomy and integrity at the national level. So Suzanne, you've just been talking about the general comment number 2, and now this big campaign together with African commissioners, with the Special Rapporteur on the Rights of Women on decriminalizing abortion. For people who haven't engaged with the Commission, with the African Commission, it seems almost impenetrable. It seems almost like impossible to even get a response from commissioners. So I do know, like, before engaging with the Commission, even myself, I'd send out an email and it felt like it was going into space. It just felt like it was going into a black hole and nothing was happening. So what are your entry points? How have you managed to engage with commissioners to the extent of being able to do the general comment, this amazing resolution 275 and the other works that you have done? Maybe if I can start with Fadzai, what were your entry points? How were you able to do this, particularly given CAL's controversial status as well with the difficulties with the African Commission?
As I was saying during my last one of the important things has really been about the networks that you have within the space. And Suzanne was speaking to it, right? Like, once you come into that space, you do realize that it looks like and feels like a club. It is. And so you do need to have networks. And it's sad to say, but I'll say it now. If you have contacts and links with international NGOs, like the probability of you making contact with commissioners is much higher. There's a lot of value that's placed on international organizations versus local or regional NGOs. So there's that. And I think beyond, I think that really is it. Once you have that entry point, then you start working on building relationships with the commissioners. Once they know who you are and what you're about, it's easier to do work with them. I think one of the most important things too is to not be blinkered or just focused on one particular issue, right? So when we talk about bodily autonomy and integrity, and in the ways that actually people view CAL, for example, the thought behind that would be because we're the Coalition of African Lesbians, therefore everything we're going to be doing in this space is going to be LGBTI focused, sexual orientation and gender identity focused. And that's not to say that we aren't about that, but there are other issues that we get involved in as well. Like, the reason why I was saying we participated in the production of a report, the study that was done by the SR on human rights defenders, is because there's work that impacts us as women and people, human rights defenders. And if you think about the definition of human rights defenders, right, it's people who are and the kinds of violations they experience is because of who they are and the work that they do, and who they are, including their sexual orientation and gender identity, comes into play. And so it's really necessary and important for us to be able to think broadly. And so CAL has done that. We have thought broadly. We have engaged in very many mechanisms or engaged with different special rapporteurs because we see the impact on our lives, right? So that, I think, is really important for people to think about as envision their work at the commission.
Thanks. And Susan, how have you managed to penetrate these impenetrable corridors of the African Commission?
I must admit, by the time I joined Ipas, we had already had a bit of a smooth ride because the beginning, from what I'm told, it was a bit of a challenge, particularly because of the topic that we discuss or that we focus on. But the one thing that I've realized and that I appreciate engaging in this space is that those of us who work in it appreciate and understand the intersectionality and indivisibility of rights. So once we come into this space, appreciating and understanding that, you do recognize that one of the entry points that you have is the networks that you have and the people that you know. So like Fadza is saying, we had the opportunity to engage with those who have already been in the space for a while. So special mention here for the Center of Human Rights in the University of Pretoria. They were really instrumental in helping us not only get observer status from the Commission, but even working on the general comment, because they had worked on the general comment number 1. And so we really used their expertise for general comment number 2. The other thing that we were able to look at was we mapped the different commissioners in the countries that we have presence. So for instance, we looked at the commissioners for Uganda, Kenya, South Africa. I'm seeing some of the participants asking how can they be able to engage with their commissioners. Like in Muluka's presentation, we were able to see where do the commissioners come from, but then we also know that other than the countries that the commissioners come from, there are also commissioners tasked with different countries from their country of origin. So I'd encourage the participants to take a look at the website, the ACHPR website. It does highlight the current 9 commissioners that we have and the countries that they're tasked with. So you can try to do that mapping and see how can they be able to support you. Other than that, we also looked at the focus of the Special Rapporteur on the Rights of Women, and there are different Special Rapporteurs based on the agenda that you have or the topic that you would like to work on. So we had an entry point of working with the Special Rapporteur on the Rights of Women, who is the one now who helped us in crafting and developing the language for the colloquia, because understanding that people have their value system and their beliefs and where they're coming from, we needed to break down those barriers of reproductive rights, abortion, contraception, some of the other languages that were coming out around the time. So we had the support of the Special Rapporteur, who then became the Vice Chair of the Commission and eventually became the Chair of the Commission. So mapping and working with these commissioners gives you that opportunity to sort of get some good statements and some good buy-in from them. And then even we sometimes reach out to them and ask them to ask the difficult questions that we as the CSOs in the room can't ask. So for instance, when a state makes their report and are not honest as they tend to be when it comes to the RH side of the Maputo Protocol, we ask the commissioners to ask the state, how far are you, and something that Muluka was presenting about Kenya, how far are you in implementing this FGM policy? How far are you in implementing X on abortion services? And so that good rapport that you have formed with the commissioners is helping with that.
Right.
The downside though is that when they do change, you have to start again. Like the cycle has to start again. And so we are going through that right now because a lot of the commissioners that were very friendly to SRHR in particular have since left. And there's a whole new crop of commissioners. So when they do leave it's how do we engage? But then we now use them in country and, okay, sorry to use the term use. We do engage with them in country and we do engage with them in other advocacy efforts.
Great, thank you. So it's a lot about networks, having people to support you. And I guess for most of the participants in here in this session, you've got ARASA as, you know, a support, and that will be useful in engaging with the African Commission, especially when you have Nyasha, who's also with the committee. But also, as you say, just the importance of engaging, building those relationships. So I suppose that's also an advantage of the African Commission when we're actually meeting pre-pandemic times, and hopefully when we have time to meet in person, it just gives that opportunity to informally engage with the commissioners, speak to them and try and build that rapport and that relationship. there's something that you've touched on, Suzanne, before. I noticed that there are a number of questions, and I want to go to those questions. But before I go there, there's something that you've touched on. We've talked about getting this general comment. We've talked about getting this amazing resolution. And these are things that are happening on the regional level. But for some of the organizations that are working in the national level, in their country, they're working in Namibia, then what, What's the big deal of having this general comment, which is just a paper? What's the big deal of having this resolution or these concluding observations? What advice would you give on how to use the concluding observations, general comments, resolutions to actually make a difference with their own government in their own country? Fadzai, can I start with you?
Sure. So let's look at, for example, Resolution 275, right? It has a set of demands, and what states should do to ensure that LGBTI people are not experiencing violence, right? And so what local organizations can do is go through the resolution, see what it is that the states are being asked to do a comparative analysis on how the state is responding. If, for example, we look at Ghana, right, and what's happening in Ghana right now, where laws and policy are being discussed and debated in Parliament that could be passed and have an adverse effect on the lives of LGBTI people. It's to then say, okay, we already noticed that this is a violation on our rights. It's discriminatory. There is violence that's coming through from the state and beyond the state. People are experiencing different forms of violence. And then to do exactly what you said right at the beginning, right, when we were giving your presentation. You can either identify a special rapporteur that you can write to directly. If you're a human rights activist, you could write to the SR human rights defenders. You can write a communication and actually say, these are the types of things that are happening in our state. I think Hedgen had also mentioned that because the ACHPR, the commission, wants evidence. You have to be able to show the types and the ways in which violence is happening. And so what falls on us as activists who are working in country is to then start documenting all of these things. Our state has done this, the press has done this, and just make sure that you have all the information that's available to you to then present and say, we have this resolution that says this, that's been adopted by this body, and this is what the state is doing. Therefore, we're calling on the African Commission to take action, and then you do the work.
Right, thank you, Susan.
Thanks, Muluka. To add on to what Fadzai is saying and even what Hedgen had mentioned earlier, one way that we have encouraged in-country organizations to work with the General Comment, the Maputo Protocol, the African Charter itself, and any other treaty like you presented, Muluka, earlier, is that an example I can give you is that in Kenya, we had the case of JMM, who was a minor who was trying to access abortion services, but unfortunately got post-abortal care, and when was trying to, got an unsafe abortion, and when was trying to get post-abortal care in a facility, it did not go as anticipated. So one of the references that was made by the Council on Record was the General Comment number 2. In Mozambique and in DRC, those who are acting on having the decriminalization of abortion in those two countries did use the Maputo Protocol and the General Comment number 2 as reference points. And then we had a reduction or less of restrictions in Mozambique and DRC, and they utilized the language from the Maputo Protocol and from General Comment number 2. Another way, like you have mentioned, Muluka, for us to keep on engaging with the commissioners is that as Ipas, we used to develop a compilation of briefs from the different countries that we work in, looking at statistics, data, and even human stories that we would share on a needs basis with the commissioners. I believe it used to be biannually, so we'd send them the briefs twice a year. So back to you.
Thank you. I've seen questions. I will open up the floor for questions. And what I'll do is I'm going to take them in order of what I've seen in the comments. I'll allow you a chance to speak. Please keep your questions brief because we are running, we're quite tight on time. So if you can keep your questions brief, questions preferably rather than comments or new presentations. And before I do that, I'm going to hand over to Hijen, who has, I think, something to add as well to the conversation. Hijen?
I just want to note, I think the reflections of Fatai and Suzanne are quite apt and quite important. One thing when I have conversation with people who approach ARASA in terms of working at the African Commission, I think sometimes it is important to understand the legal position of the African Commission. It is not a court. They don't have any ability to impose any real consequences to states when they violate human rights, or they don't have any actual power to enforce a resolution or to enforce recommendations that they make or demands that they make, or however you want to frame it, in concluding observations. So it is important to always understand that any work that happens at these regional human rights instruments or international human rights instruments must always go hand in hand with local advocacy. Resolution 275 is amazing, but it is very necessary to understand that without taking it back to the countries themselves and use it on local advocacy, it remains a piece of paper. And I think at times, I find that a lot of activists who who for the first time go to African Commission tend to look at it too much as if it's some sort of court that can address issues in their country. Rather, I think it's always useful to look at African Commission as a tool where it's possible in order to further national issues in your own country, rather than as a body that can actually do something substantial. It delivers soft law, not hard law. It delivers recommendations that you can use in your countries. The African Commission Charter has been signed by your country, which means is that you can take the outcomes of the African Commission into your country when you're doing local advocacy on diverse issues. And I think it's very important to never forget that the African Commission in itself will only ever be a tool to further the advocacy that you do on a local level. It's a very important tool, and it's very necessary that we continue advocating for its independence, especially, but also for strong human rights-based language on sexual reproductive health, on body autonomy, integrity, sexual orientation. But we can never lose track of the fact is that it is still limited in terms of the practical things they can do in your country. They often can't. They can't even visit your country to effect finding mission without permission of the country. So if you have a country that is very homophobic and your country is not willing to allow the African Commission to come into your country, then you already face a limitation. So you need to really look at how are you going to take those tools and those instruments on the regional level, and how are you going to find ways, for example, finding local parliamentarians in your country and tell them, hey, there is this resolution, can we have a conversation about that? And trying to find entryways and networking in country and utilize in that essentially these tools, these resolutions, these communications, and these observations. And I think that link can never be lost. And that is really where I think a lot of local organizations and national organizations can truly shine and truly leverage the African Commission.
Okay, so thank you. I'll give Nyasha a chance to speak before we move on to the questions. So Nyasha?
And I can see that your time is flying. I think one thing, without repeating what everyone else has said, that I want to highlight is the fact that there is a reason why we're actually talking about the African Commission on Human and People's Rights, as opposed to other mechanisms like the UPR, like CEDAW, etc. And part of this is this, and for me, part of that is what gives us a powerful tool on how to use what comes out of the African Commission, right? That this is supposed to be an African space based on treaties, soft law, resolutions, etc., that have been agreed on by African countries. So in all the work that we do, so whether it is access to abortion and, autonomy and gender issues as Ipas would do, or it's, these kind of so-called controversial issues that we deal with, which oftentimes are then, the pushback is around, this is an agenda, a Western agenda, etc. Being able to utilize the African Commission space in conjunction with all the other international spaces that we use in itself is powerful. So when you take something that comes from the African Commission that has been put together by a group of Africans that has been agreed to by African states with no one putting pressure on them, gives you a very powerful tool to be able to go back in country and say, no. Bodily autonomy and integrity is very much an African value. Why? Because it's in the African Charter on Human and People's Rights. So that's just one thing that I wanted to highlight as something that we can actually take from what comes out of the African Charter, and what can be different about it from what would come out of, for example, CEDAW as another useful mechanism that we can use. And back over to you, Muluka.
Great. I'm going to hand over to questions, and I think we'll take a number of questions at the time. I've seen some of the questions in the chat, and perhaps what we'll do is read out those questions. But Omar, I want to give you a chance because I'm not sure if I understood your question. So if maybe you could briefly explain to us your question.
So my question was, it was stated earlier to Fadzai, and they mentioned that there was scrutiny given to their organization in how they operate. So I just wanted to know, is that same level of scrutiny given to how other organizations operate, especially organizations that do have observer status? And then if I can, just very, very quickly, Article 144 of Namibia's constitution says that international law becomes domestic law, right? So then is there any tips that our panelists can give us here in Namibia as we progress to advocate for the realization of like women's rights and LGBTQ people's rights, if like the commission isn't really a court, and if the African court hasn't been very, very much, how do I say, like on this issue to hold states accountable in this aspect.
Great, thanks, Omar. So those are two questions, one to Fadzai and I think to both of you on the advice. Before we go on to answering, I think we'll take a couple of, or I'll read out the other questions together and then we can read, answer the set of questions. So there's a question from Agrippa, I think it is, who asked, how effective are the colloquia discussion, considering that state representatives are bound by their state policy? I believe that would be to Suzanne, who mentioned doing Ipas work in this regard. And then we have another, I think it's from Gumisai, who says, my challenge is if we have commissioners who have different views, like they are Christians, and I want their help as a lesbian or trans woman, how then do I engage with them in country? That's a question to both of you from Gumisai. And I think those are the questions we have at the moment. We can answer those questions. If there's anyone with a burning question, please do raise your hand. But for the moment, I'll let Fadzai and Suzanne answer those questions. Perhaps if we start with Fadzai, as his first question was actually to you.
The first question, which is from Omar, around scrutiny. So the question was, do other organizations experience scrutiny in the same way that CAL does? If I got that correctly.
Well, yes, I think so.
I'm not entirely sure if other organizations experience it the way CAL does. And I think the level of scrutiny that CAL is under is because of the ways in which we do our work, the issues that we're talking about, sexuality, sexual orientation, sex, gender. And so and women actually speaking about that, right? Women in all our diversity in how we think about the people who are working at CAL. So there's a particular kind of scrutiny on us because as women, there's a particular way we should also be behaving within that space, right? And the things that we should be talking about and the ways in which we talk about them. I'm not sure if that's the experience of other organizations. And I'm sure it is, right, depending on the types of issues that you're bringing. If we're to look at, for example, the SRHR case, and please excuse me that I do not know their full name. SRHR was also had their observer status withdrawn, and it was because they are challenging their state, right? They're actively challenging the state of Rwanda. And so Rwanda also didn't want SRHR to have observer status. And so there is scrutiny on that organization, and it's based on the ways in which they want to hold their country accountable for the violations that are happening in the country, and in a country in Africa that's considered to be a beacon of democracy and all of these things that we hear about. We hear Rwanda being about, but also knowing that there is something else that's happening in Rwanda that's really problematic. When it comes to freedom of press, the number of people who've been detained who are from opposition parties, the curtailing of expression, any kind of dissent against the state. So there are different levels of surveillance that happen, but it does happen. I just can't speak to what it looks like for individual organizations, but we know that it happens.
Thanks. And maybe if we can address those two questions. There was advice on implementation of human rights standards from the African Commission in Namibia, given that Namibia says international treaties are directly applicable. And then also how to address commissioners in country if the commissioners have different values. So Suzanne, maybe if you want to try and tackle those first.
Thanks, Muluka. Probably what I can add to what Fadza has said, and okay, we could be also a bit biased, given that we are noisemakers, activists, human rights defenders, but it is my opinion that there has not been that level of scrutiny like what I saw with CAL. And that's because we have had other organizations receive and do their applications for observer status since then. And I have never seen discussions on the floor of the commission of observer status for other organizations. So like Fadza was saying before, the commissioners at this point were tasked to deliberate on it in the open session. And that's not happened before. And to the best of my knowledge, it's not happened again. At least in the ones that I've attended, be it physical or online, I've never seen that. But then to come to the question of, there was some feedback from someone in Zimbabwe, and I just wanted to encourage them that other than what Nyasha was saying in terms of how do we bring back the soft law principles from the ACHPR, the UN frameworks, to the countries, I would like to encourage the person from Zimbabwe that there was a particular case on access to abortion services by someone known as Mildred Mapingure, who unfortunately was a victim of gang rape and went through an unfortunate circumstance. So I would encourage you to read up on that case and see what can you be able to borrow as an activist of SRHR in that space. But then I do appreciate that, unfortunately, a lot of countries do tend to have restrictive laws or laws that persons living in the country are not able to interrogate because of lack of awareness or just general lack of knowledge. And then looking at the question that was asked about Namibia's law, has an article on international law becoming law when it's ratified. We have a similar provision in the Kenyan law. It's Article 2 of our Kenyan law. I think some of these countries, we like doing copy and paste from each other. So I'd have to check when Namibia's constitution was put into place. But the challenge that we have in Kenya, and the person from Namibia would tell us, if they have the same challenge. But then in Kenya now, how our policymakers have become a bit naughty about that article or that provision is that now they say that Parliament now has to come and discuss these particular issues that have been implemented abroad. So you find that they'll really discuss or go to great length when it comes to issues of the economy, but when it comes to issues of the socioeconomic rights, they hardly go through that same level of scrutiny. So for instance, recently we were trying to get into an agreement with Britain after the Brexit. We're trying to get into an agreement with Britain on some exports and imports issues. That was really discussed at length in Parliament. However, no other socioeconomic issues have been discussed at that level. So what I would encourage the person from Namibia is that what we do in Kenya is that we have created a very good rapport with the National Human Rights Institution. And so we try to go through them when it comes to the ratifications and the international laws and the commitments that we have made, because they tend to be quite a number. Right now, we are trying to push for the ICPD plus 25 commitments. We now have the generation equality commitments, and there are various others that your countries may have done. So engage with the National Human Rights Institution or the commissions that you have to be able to see how you can domesticate and implement the issues that are at the international level.
Right.
The last question that came out on how effective the colloquia are, I would suggest a similar response in terms of how can you work with the commissioners in country and how can you work with the commissions and the human rights institutions that you have. Back to you, Muluka.
Great. I think the conversation is very interesting. I'm enjoying it. We could go on, but we are running short of time. So I think we're going to end it there, and I will hand back. First of all, I will give our wonderful panelists a break, because I think having their face on spotlight can get a bit tiring. So Suzanne and Pazai, thank you very much. And thank you for your contribution and your conversations. We can continue these conversations offline. I will also give you both a break and remove you from spotlight. And I will now hand back to Nyasha, who will end off our session for today.
Thank you so much, Muluka, and again, Suzanne and Fadzai, for your inputs. I just wanted to be naughty and address the question around the legal provisions first before I go into the closing. So it's a little bit of an abuse of my position, but indulge me, please. But just around that provision in the Namibian constitution, which talks about international law in Namibia automatically becoming law, there is a rider on it that says that as long as it is in line with the constitution and other legislation in Namibia. So one of the tricks that I could probably give you there is always go back to the constitution, right? And the constitution of Namibia has some really nice broad human rights provisions. So one of the challenges that we usually have as civil society organizations is we go and we look for specific provisions on SRHR, right? When we might have provisions within our constitution that might not directly look like they speak to the issues of SRHR, but do. So the provisions around the right to dignity, for example, the provisions around the right to equality that we've already spoken of, and discrimination is already in our constitution, and provisions that have got to do with security of the person, for example. So I'll give an example that I was involved, for example, in the case in Namibia around the case on sterilization of women living with HIV. And really some of the rights that we fell on in the constitution of Namibia were the very broad rights that on the face of it might not seem like they're talking about sexual and reproductive rights generally, but then looking at the principles there. So again, that issue of a lot of the times, everyone wants to go and work with the special rapporteur on women. But if for whatever reason that might be complicated, there's the special rapporteur on torture, right? Which you can go and talk about abortion issues with. So being creative around the rights that you have within your framework, your constitutional framework, and asking ourselves the question, how do these rights broadly touch on sexual and reproductive rights issues, even if they don't mention the word sexual and reproductive rights within them. So those rights, liberty, security of the person, dignity, you know, those kinds of rights. And then just in closing, again, to thank everyone on the panel. We do know that some of you are real experts in some of the engagement with the African system. We would love to hear a little bit more from you. Please email us and share your experience with us. I just wanted to say ARASA engages quite vigorously at the African Commission space on various issues. Muluka has already mentioned the fact that I sit as an expert on the HIV committee, which is a real entry point for issues related to LGBT rights that one can use. I actually wanted to highlight the report which Muluka had on screen earlier, the report on HIV and human rights in Africa that the African Commission through the committee did a few years ago, and the opportunities that are there, because it speaks specifically to issues of criminalization of sexual orientation and gender identity, and speaks specifically to issues of rights of minorities, including rights of other key populations such as sex workers, people who use drugs, etc. So just looking at some of these platforms and where the entry points can be in terms of having conversations around protecting bodily autonomy and integrity for rights of all people. And then having said that, just to invite you to the next two sessions that we will be having in this series of meetings. The one next week will look specifically on the African Committee of Experts on the Rights and Welfare of the Child. Someone asked in the chat earlier on around engaging specifically on issues of adolescent girls and young women, and this is a particular platform that can be used for engagement on adolescent issues. One of the things that we have recognized as ARASA is that there appears to be very few national and Pan-African organizations that are engaging at the space of the African Committee. We do hope, and I hope that this will not change, we do have a confirmation from someone who is actually sitting within the African Committee of Experts to come and talk to us a little bit more about how to work with the system and how to, particularly working on sexual and reproductive rights of children and adolescents. So we really are looking forward to that particular session and that particular conversation, which will be a kind of an insider conversation. They want to engage more on issues related to sexual and reproductive health and rights of young people. So we're looking forward to that session next week. And then the following one will be around really engaging with the more political side of things with, you know, the ministers of health, the ministers of trade, economics, etc., and figure out how we navigate those political spaces within the African Union Commission, and have some really exciting speakers as well for that session. Hejin, I don't think we have time to actually play that little snippet on the added value of the African Commission. So I think we can, of the African Committee of Experts on the Right of the Child. So I think we can leave it for next week. And as I talk, probably just put the polls up for the evaluation. But really, again, to thank you all for taking the time, having the interest in utilizing the African human rights systems for advocacy on bodily autonomy and integrity. As many of you might know, ARASA started a campaign recently on bodily autonomy and integrity. One of the things that our partners said to us was, how do we speak about bodily autonomy and integrity with African ownership? And really say that bodily autonomy and integrity is an African value, because it is. But how do we raise our voices on challenging this notion that concepts of bodily autonomy and integrity are not African values. And this is part of the motivation for this focus on the African human rights systems. So again, please do reach out to us. As has been said several times, ARASA is observer status at the African Commission. We often utilize that observer status to hide our partners under our wings, in the sense that we allow you to use our observer status to make a statement on your issue, on your statement, if you don't have your own. We also are happy to guide you through the process of getting observer status, should you need to. And we also are quite happy to help with alternative reporting where that kind of assistance is needed. So just putting out there the things that ARASA is able to do for the partner organizations. And then I just realized that we did not give our panelists 2 minutes each or a minute each to say goodbye. So I am actually going to go back to them and actually give them a minute each for closing remarks, and Muluka, a minute for you for closing remarks as well. But I will not come back. We will consider this my closing statement, and look forward to seeing you next week, Wednesday, when we talk about the African Committee on the Rights of the Child. So Muluka, when you say your goodbyes, you can close the meeting. Suzanne, I'll start with you.
Thank you, Nyasha. My closing remarks, or my final remarks, would be just to encourage the participants in the room that, yes, I know we have spoken at length about the commission, and I know it might seem like quite a daunting commission to engage with, but please do go through their website, see the complementarity of the African Commission and the other Africa Union organs. Like Nyasha has mentioned, we'll be going through the webinar series. So for instance, I'd like to encourage you to look through the regional economic communities that your country is a member of. So for instance, in the SADC, in the South African bloc, we have the South Africa Development Corporation that also has a very good SRHR framework that they had. In East Africa, we are trying to develop that right now in terms of the EAC SRHR bill. Under the Africa Union framework, we also have the Africa Union Secretariat, and we have the Pan-African Parliament. The Pan-African Parliament are very instrumental in creating a model law for freedom of information. So for those of us who are in this space, it's been interesting to see the complementarity between all these organs that we have been discussing. So to just encourage you to please reach out when you do need support, like Nyasha has said, but it's not as bad as we have said it is. We were just trying to be, conversatory, but we do look forward to seeing more people in this space. Thank you, Nyasha, and thank you everyone for your kind attention.
Thank you, Ipas. Thank you for the partnership. Fadzai, your closing remarks.
No, somehow I'd actually started smiling because I was like, I'm not really like the closing off person, but I think one of the biggest things I want to say is thank you. Thank you for the space and the platform to speak about the African Commission. I think it's really necessary and important for us to be able to speak to participants, people who haven't been at the African Commission, and let them know what's true and real about the space, because it is a difficult space to work in. But there are people too who are there, who are willing to support, hold hands, and provide solidarity as we're in that space and doing the work that we're doing. And I know that the conversation is about the African Commission, and we're talking about regional bodies as well, like the RECs. But I think important to think about are the international mechanisms. At some point, Nyasha, I think you spoke about CEDAW. So CEDAW, for example, Commission on the Status of Women, there's some useful language that has come out of those spaces, including the Human Rights Council, actually, related to bodily autonomy and integrity, that sometimes our states actually lift and use in country. So it is important to follow all of those things, right? What's happening regionally, sub-regionally, and internationally, and see how it's impacting the work that you're doing nationally. Or actually to even give you space in which to think creatively about how you can do your work nationally. So yeah, those are my closing remarks. Just be creative about the ways in which you want to work and do advocacy. It's not a straitjacket. Cool.
Thank you, Fadzai.
Thank you, Nyasha, and thank you, Fadzai. I'm just going to share the results briefly, if I can, the results of the poll. So it looks like 100% of those who responded found this webinar informative, which is what we'd like to hear. We will be sharing, I believe we'll be sharing the slides because there's a lot of information that I went through quite quickly. If you have any questions, please do contact Nyasha, do contact Hijin with any follow-up questions. I look forward to engaging with you as well next week when we look at the African Commission of Experts on the Rights and Welfare of the Child. And just to reiterate what everyone has said, that we were being realistic about the African Commission, realistic about the challenges, and there are challenges, but at the same time, from what you can see, from what we have discussed, it is still worthwhile engaging with the African Commission. And it is a useful platform for ensuring promotion and protection of rights, including sexual reproduction, sexual rights and health rights, SRHR, and bodily autonomy and integrity. So I would encourage you, if you've not thought of it before, to try and engage now. Part of the advantages of the pandemic is that the sessions are a little more accessible because they're online at the moment. So you don't need to fly all the way to the Gambia or wherever it is. It's a little less accessible in the sense that it might be a bit more daunting and a bit more difficult to actually speak to people and have the informal communication and network. But for every negative, there's always a positive. So I'd encourage you to look out for the session starting October, November time this year and to participate. And if you've got any questions, Arasa is available to provide support in this. So thank you for your participation. We look forward to seeing you, those of you who participate, and I hope it will be all of you in next week's session. Thank you all. And that